Welcome to the Queerest Podcast, your cosmic guide to the queer universe. Hosted by Andraé BVR, each episode takes you on an interstellar journey through queer culture, identity, and influence. From dismantling media tropes to exploring queer representation, we invite you to challenge norms and expand your horizons. So buckle up and set your phasers to fabulous. Close encounters of the queerest kind await.
Greetings, cosmic queers and allies. I am your host, Andraé BVR, and this is the Queerest Podcast, your cosmic guide through the ever-expanding universe of queer culture, identity, and influence. Today's episode is about reconciliation, the kind that asks us not to choose between our identities, but to expand them, to embrace contradiction as a form of truth. I mean, what happens when different facets of who we are aren't competing, but are working together? We'll explore all that and more with today's guest, Dr. Raja Gopal Bhattar, a higher ed changemaker, writer, and thought leader whose work invites us to rethink what it means to belong. So here's how we're charting today's course. We'll kick things off with an incoming transmission, checking on what's lighting up the queer universe. Then we'll beam into a deep space dive with Dr. Bhattar about queering constellations, reclaiming community, and shifting systems of power. And finally, we'll wrap up with the final frontier, our cosmic rapid-fire round of questions. But first, let's scan the queer skies. You are now tuned in to the incoming transmission, our signal check on the queer universe. From culture shifts to policy moves, this is where we track what's changing and how we move through it together. In a world that demands neat labels and simple narratives, what does it mean to live in the in-between? For queer folks carrying layered identities, race, gender, citizenship, ability, culture, and class, the idea of belonging can feel slippery. Systems rarely make space for intersectionality, and often when they do, it's conditional. But here's the truth. Queerness has always thrived in complexity, in contradiction, in multiplicity. So what happens when we stop asking where we fit in and start asking what it means to be whole? That's the question at the heart of Queering Constellations, mapping this journey called life. It's exactly where we're headed next, so let's beam into today's deep space dive. Dr. Raja, welcome to the Queerest Podcast.
Thank you so much, Andraé. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm so excited to have you. Let's just get into it. And let's start off with, obviously, in Queering Constellations, you describe yourself as a queer, gender non-conforming, 1.5 generation immigrant from the lineage of Hindu spiritual leaders. Mm-hmm. When you think about the mix of identities, when did you first notice the tensions between how the world wanted to define you and the truth of who you were?
Oh, that's such a big question. I mean, how much time do you have, right?
We have as much as we need.
No, I think it's such an important question, right? Because I think it's interesting because, putting it in the West, in a more American or Western context, we think of the idea as kind of like these layers or these mosaic or puzzle pieces. But in like an Eastern context, it's not that. It's more like a soup of just all the things blended together. It's really hard to kind of pull them apart. But I remember, I was born in India and I moved to the US when I was 7, and moving from southern India to suburban Chicago to a small town called Lamont, Illinois, where I was one of 2 brown kids in the whole school and like didn't speak a lot of English and just felt like, and it was in the middle of March. And so you go from like warm pre-summer, late spring in India to like the middle of winter in Chicago. So that was like very like a very initial like what the F is going on moment in my life. I was also living with my aunt and uncle who I'd only met a couple of times before, who had adopted me recently. And so that was really interesting, like who am I and where do I sit? But it wasn't really until probably like junior high school where I really started to understand my queerness. And that became kind of the impetus for all the other shiftings as well, because they're all interconnected. And so really thinking about what does it mean for me to be queer in a culture that tells me I cannot be queer because we don't even talk about sex, let alone sexuality? What does it mean to be brown in a culture that says that whiteness is important, both in a US context in a very white and black framework where I don't know where I fit in. But then also even in an Indian context where in a post-colonial India, there's still a lot of colorism and whiteness and British kind of residue, if you will.
Yeah.
Right. And so I've always felt like I love Gloria Anzaldua's work around the Borderlands, Las Fronteras, right? Because she talks about like being at the borderlands. It's like, I've always been at the borderlands. I think for a long time, there's a lot of shame around feeling not in the middle of things and not feeling like I'm always the other. And yet I think part of the beauty of that work, I think when you think about the tension, I think that I've known the tension for most of my life. I don't know if there's a particular moment that's like, this is when it started.
Right.
But when I started to make sense of it and accept it was what I think when I approached Gloria's work and really thinking about what does it mean that like the borderlands is actually where we get to create, right? If you think about the tectonic plates of the earth, where's all the volcanoes and new earth forming is at the edges, is not at the middle. And so embracing kind of the tension, but the tension gives way to birth. And that's really exciting. So I think that's kind of where maybe I would go.
Yeah. And actually, I read that as well. And I remember because I was a Chicano studies major at UCLA. And so like, that was like a big part of like, exactly, go Bruins. And that was such a big part of it. It's just like being in the in-between of like, I'm not this, I'm not that. And just like being okay in this like nebulous place and just embracing all that kind of like is a part of that experience. Cause it's like, everything is such a binary that it's like, you're either this or you're that. But like that experience of not being able to explore the in-between, I think is, there's so much to uncover there. And there's so much to like learn about oneself by being in this like in-between space that I think like a lot of people who like kind of fit within that binary, like often don't experience, which is like, they have a hard time sometimes recognizing like what that experience is like, or they just let, pick a side or, you're one thing or other. And it's like, it's not that simple. It's like life is much more complex and expansive than I think people want to think it is. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. No, I totally agree with you. I think I would even go as far as saying it's a decolonializing process or a liberatory practice to kind of be in the tension and to embrace the tension. And I think, again, we're, as a culture, particularly in the US culture, there's so much focus on comfort and ease that growth does not happen in comfort and ease. And many of us that have existed in these borderlands and these tension points not only have thrived at the tension, but actually have understood our purpose on earth because of the tension. And like, people are like, would you ever choose to be non-queer? I'm like, no. Would you ever choose to be non-brown? No. Because I'm like, I actually am grateful for the lessons I'm learning and that I'm able to show up in the world that I do the way I do because of it. And it'd be quite boring if I wasn't.
Oh my gosh, so no, it's so much more rich and beautiful to be able to have these experiences than to fit within this like mayonnaise style, lifestyle that is just so simplistic. It's just like one dimensional, and it's like you don't really get to experience the beauty of what life can be with all of its complexities and nuances. You know what I mean?
I agree.
Yeah. So I want to kind of talk about a little bit about your personal coming out story. The book shares parts of your coming out journey and how it shaped your understanding of belonging. What were some of like the hardest truths you had to face about yourself and others during that time?
Oh, gosh, there's so much to start there. Again, I grew up in a temple in a very traditional South Asian Orthodox community of folks who like part of my family traces our lineage back to some of the origins of modern day Vaishnavite Hinduism. And so there's lots of kind of cultural, not baggage, but cultural ties and roots that are really important to the way I see the world because of the way my family brought me up. But part of that is if you ever go to a Hindu temple, part of the rituals that happen are these like literally wedding rituals that happen between the gods in the ceremony. So like marriage and kind of heteronormativity and progenization, right, is such an important part of Hindu culture as a source of cultural preservation. The idea that like you get married, you're born, you're either male or female, and you get married and you have children and then you die. And then like it's every part of culture is defined by that structure. And as someone that's never fit that, it's always been a really intense tension for me. And so I remember when I was about 10 or 11 years old, I mean, I had been told this since I was like even younger kid, but I remember around 10 or 11 really being aware of the fact that my family had a prearranged marriage for me with this woman in India who my mother and her mother were really good friends, and they had talked because she's like 6 months younger than me. They were pregnant at the same time, so they were like, once we both were born, they was like, oh, they're gonna get married. They're like, and it was just assumed that. And like I remember my sister and her sister, who are also best friends, would like perform little child weddings for us just for the fun of it as part of their play. So it was just like, it was so normalized that this is just what was going to happen. And so for me to recognize one, to say, this is not, can I do it? Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of things we can do in life that might not be aligned, but I feel like it felt so inauthentic to me, partially to feel like it wasn't who I'm meant to love and who I'm meant to be with. And life is too short to do things that don't make you happy, right? But also at the same time, thinking that I'm also ruining this woman's life for the sake of my own fear and my own lack of courage to be able to. And so that was, I think, one of the really earlier moments of a lot of crying at night, a lot of suicidal ideation. I'm like, what if I just died? And like, that would just like take all the issues away. Like I wouldn't have to deal with the other undoings and unravelings, if you will, if I just wasn't part of the picture. And then recognizing that doesn't feel good for me either, because my life is too rich and I like my life too much, in the things I get to do and the beauty I get to see around the world. And so I remember that tension being such a critical, just a lot of gut-wrenching, soul-searching work around what does it actually mean to hold around this, and what does it mean for me to not only take my own agency away in my queerness and the fact that like loving someone is so beautiful, and why am I shamed by this, and what does it mean? But also at a point where as a 10 or 11 year, I had no vision of queerness beyond like a very gay post HIV AIDS pandemic post, right? This is like still late 90s. And so, or maybe mid 90s. So it's like, it's still in the middle of HIV and kind of in the US, and I'm just jumping into it and like learning about that. And so understanding like queerness, really not as queer, but really as a gay white male experience with all this shame and fear, kind of in an internal cultural sense, but then also an external kind of Western medicalized HIV death sense, really, at that point. Yep. And then also this other tension around not seeing any brownness in the queer spaces anywhere, any visions. So there's like maybe Ellen later on, in like the early 2000s, but before there was not really even that. And it was like Rock Hudson, really. It was like the only real like person that I can think of at that point when I was like a 10-year-old that was like culturally accessible to me. And any of the South Asian images in the South Asian culture, so much of the films and the Bollywood songs and all that, there was just a romanticization, heteronormativity, and just feeling that tension, not feeling myself represented. And if it was represented, it was very much a trans person or someone dressed in drag as a source of comedy or silliness. And so there was never a celebration. It was a poking fun of or using it as a comedy tool. And really, but then at the same time feeling like, but all of our rituals and literature, there's one particular ceremony in Hindu tradition where the male god gets dressed up as a woman and gets walked around town. And you're like, this is interesting, because like as a culture that's very binary and very heteronormative, this does not feel like that. So I think for me, it was the hard truth was really around the fact that I didn't fit anywhere, and that it felt like I was somehow broken or wrong. And because I never saw myself I was either saw myself as like a gay person that didn't feel like me either, and like white, and that wasn't me, or brown and straight, and that wasn't me either. And there was just it was a vacuum. It felt like I was in this little black hole of creation, that somehow I was like a little blip. And I think for me, so that was hard. But then the truth was really understanding, letting go of the shame of feeling like, why me, to thinking about like, oh, this is actually kind of cool. It helps me be more critical about the rest of the world, because I'm having to be critical about the coreness of who I am. And so once I'm able to really be clear about my own core, then everything else, it's like, once the crystal is polished, everything else shines differently.
Ooh, I love that. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
A quick question. So I think this is something that I think still a lot of like heterosexual identifying men kind of deal with, specifically around like not being able to tap into their own, sexual identity, and then end up marrying women who, even though they know they may have like homosexual tendencies or are not fitting within the binary that exists for them. And then they end up, getting divorced later because of all those things. Like, how did you have the wherewithal to know, like, this was not for me, and I don't want to pursue this further. And I know you kind of touched on that a little bit, but I'm like, how did you make that decision to say like, I'm not doing this, I'm not moving forward, I don't want to ruin her life, I don't want to ruin my life? Like, where did you kind of come to that conclusion?
Yeah, I think it was recognizing that, like, I mean, part of the Hindu framework is karma and dharma, right? Karma, I feel like we have consequences to our actions, and we kind of have to, whether in this lifetime or not, some other lifetime, you have to deal with your at some point. You can't escape any of this shit at some point, right? So there's like the fact that like my actions and my behavior has a reaction and influences other. There's ripple effects that are really important. So it's not just I get to what I think such a kind of a Western understanding of authenticity is like, I get to do whatever I want to do. I just get to show up as I am. I'm like, yeah, but if you're a bull in a China shop and you being yourself is destroying everything and leaving, that's not actually being you. That's just being a jackass, right?
Yeah.
You actually have to take responsibility for the impact of your actions as well. That's really critical to the way we think about karmic balancing in the world, right? In a very Eastern philosophy sense. And the Dharma is that there's a sense of purpose, right? There's like, what is your true purpose in the world? And what are you actually supposed to do in the world? And how are you supposed to exist? And being a 1.5 generation kid that like felt like I grew up in these two values being really important, understanding kind of cultural values and honoring family, etc. But then I coming to the US and feel like there's a sense of individual celebration of I can be who I am and I don't have to be only what you want me to be. That's also part of the tension that led to that space where I was like, I don't want to have the guilt of ruining someone else's life because I was too afraid to be myself. Because one thing, if I were to kill myself or harm myself or like, do something, like, I'd rather be responsible for my actions that influence me, but not necessarily my actions that influence other people's lives without them having an agency in that too, right? And so partially initially, I remember calling her when I was like 11 or 12 at this point. Like, well, I don't know what the fuck I was doing.
Oh, wow. Very young.
Yeah. And I was like, I don't think it's going to work. I don't like you in this way. And I found I didn't know the language of saying I'm queer. And I'm like, this is just, because it was also just felt really awkward because it just wasn't part of my linguistic practices at that time. But to really feel like I was like, I just don't like you. Like I was very mean, right? And now I'm like, okay, that was probably not a nice thing to say. But it was like, that was the only way I could express my language. But I think for me, it really was the sense of core to who I am. It is important for me to be true to who I'm supposed to be and who I'm meant to be. And then there's a story right in the book that talks about kissing the main deity at the temple, and one of my it's one of my favorite, most powerful moments, and feeling like God would not have made me this way if something was wrong, if I'm broken, right? Because God doesn't do broken things. Whatever she looks like, whatever they look like, right? And so if I'm having these are not shameful or something problematic, but actually it's like if I'm truly divine, because one of the mantras that's really important in one of our scriptures, Aham Brahmasmi, I am made of the same stardust and divinity as the entire universe. So how dare I not be true to myself and do what I'm meant to do, even if that means that it's painful, but it's at least mitigating unintentional harm and ruining someone else's life without their agency.
Yeah. And honestly, like to have that level of like introspection, I think at 12 years old, you said, like, that's wild. Like there are adults that don't have that level of like understanding of themselves and like the impact of their actions. So like hat tip to you on that one. Cause like, that's so impressive that you were able to like navigate this situation, maybe not as well as you probably would have done now, but like you still were able to recognize like, this is something I need to address. I cannot move forward with this. And I want to make sure that I'm not setting her up to be part of like this situation that like, I don't even want to be a part of myself. Like that's super like, self-aware, which I think is amazing.
Well, I think it really was due to like having seen my mother become a widow at such a young age and seeing how she was treated and kind of the lack of respect that women get, even though a lot of our goddesses are women, right? Like we honor them and also we destroy them. It's really in human form, but we honor them in divine form. And this really interesting dichotomy that happens, and again, happens in the US as well, right? The disrespect, but then also having come to the US and being a child of two adoptive parents who were in such deep pain that didn't know how much they were harming me. Because of their own actions, and recognizing how much that put me into a tailspin. For me, I was like, so I could see the similarity. So I think having been the recipient of that trauma and that harm, again, unintentionally. They were not trying to hurt me, right? But they were just in so much pain, and they still are, and they just have not ever been able to figure out how to work through it. And you have to go through it. You can't, we were talking about earlier, like the phoenix has to be able to burn before it actually rises. It can't just do a little sidestep. And so I think for me, it was just like having experienced how harmful it was for me. It was really important for me to feel like I was not then causing harm to other people. And that's been a core value for me as well.
I love that. More people need to have that as core value. Like
me, I agree. I have a list of people.
Literally, exactly. So obviously in Queer and Constellations, you write about the false binaries many queer people are pushed into, family or freedom, tradition or authenticity. Was there a moment in your life when those forces felt especially in conflict? And how did you begin to bridge the gap for that?
I think my whole life is that tension. It just feels like it. But it's interesting. I really appreciated that question when I read it, because I'm like, no one's asked me that question before, right? In this particular context, it's a really interesting question of like, what does it actually mean to the conflict? Again, I think one was the marriage point. So there's a moment, and I don't know if I'm at this point, it's funny, you write this book and you're like, what did I write in the book? Is it in there?
Exactly, right?
There's just so many edits to it. But there was a moment of probably a little bit later on, like in my probably like 1920-ish, maybe like late teens, early 20s, where it was my grandfather was about to die. He had just gotten diagnosed with cancer. So I went to India for a couple months. I wanted to see him. And so the family tried to do an intervention where they tried to sit me without telling me. It was the secret intervention. They sat me down with my grandfather in the middle of the living room. We have a pretty big living room in our family home. And all the aunts and uncles and the siblings, and like 45 people are sitting around us in a circle. And the little fishbowl. And they're like, so what are you going to do? Are you going to marry her or not? I'm like, and I was like, I wasn't sure how to come out to them in the context that made sense, that would make sense to them. Because I was like, so much of my queerness and understanding of queerness is Western linguistic understanding of it. And like in English, I'm like, I don't know how to say that in Canada, because to people that don't even talk about queerness, let alone how do you talk about queerness or outness, or like why heteronormative marriages may not be helpful to someone who is not heteronormative, right? So I remember that being one of those moments where I was like, what the do I do in my life? And how do I navigate this? And I'm so grateful. And so part of the intention was some of my uncles, you've read about some of my uncles in the book who are really fascinating. But there's another uncle of mine he was finding lots of pleasure in this tension. He thought he was going to like find a way to like corner me and like just get me. Like I've had death threats on my life, my family. I've had them threaten me to like take my passport. Actually, at one point they did take my passport away and like locked it away to like prevent me from leaving. I've had them say they're going to lock me up until I get married and force me. Like there's all this stuff has happened, right? And but that all that had happened by then. I'm still sitting there and like, what the heck do I do? Do I just get it over with just for the sake of it and then figure it out? But I think there was a core sense of myself. Like that does not feel like I cannot live with myself if I destroy someone else's life. And that's just, and it was because even at one point I remember calling her and she was like, yeah, it's fine. Whatever. You do what you need to do. I'll do what I do. And I was like, no, that doesn't like, that's not a life, right? For me, like it's not a life for me.
Exactly.
But I remember my grandfather, again, he's on his deathbed, right? Like, and he is one of the most staunch Orthodox people that I've ever known in my life, and very traditional. And he was someone like, as a priest, he would yell at people at their own weddings because they were not saying or doing rituals properly, right? That's like, for me, like, that's like when I think of my grandfather, that's like his level of like, you do the rituals properly because then you do think that you're supposed to. So he's like this very traditional Orthodox person. But I remember sitting in the circle and just like crying with my life and being like, what the do I do? And then I remember him, it was just one of the sweetest moments. He was like, Raja, I know your heart. And he said, if this is not what you want, then don't do it. And it, like coming from anyone would be, but like coming from my grandfather, and everyone was just like speechless because everyone was just like, what the heck just happened? Because like we thought he was going to be like you could not get, my grandfather is like a pretty powerful force, or was a powerful force, right? And so like they thought it was just like it was a bag in, there was like I was just going to roll over. And for him to be like, at this type of life, I think he understood his own mortality, right? He had stage 4 prostate cancer. Right. And I've been a caretaker and I'm always a caretaker whenever I'm in place. Like that's one of my archetypes that's just really important. And And so I remember when I was there, I would take care of him. So he actually got to know me a little bit more than like just seeing each other on, phone calls or whatever. But it was just really sweet for him to feel like, if this is not what you want, then you don't do it.
Wow.
And that for me was really what shifted, and that allowed me to, like, once he was okay for some reason, once he, like, I saw him as like the epitome of tradition and orthodoxy, and for him to be able to like, do what you want, like, if there's not what you want, don't do it. Like, that just unlocked something for me significantly. And then the other piece for me, I think about the bridge, the gap. The binary was less about queerness. Oddly enough, it was more about my college choice.
Right.
And so I remember I was looking at colleges. I grew up in Connecticut, right, for a long time. And I wanted to go to NYU or Boston University. And my family was like, no, that's too far. And I was like, it's 2 hours away, y'all. It's not that far, right? But again, for them, it was like, but culturally, it felt so far away.
Right.
And everyone that my parents knew at the temple as first-gen low-income folks were like, everyone they knew, like, their kids went to UConn. So well, my parents were like, if it's good enough for children of doctors and lawyers, why is it not good enough for you? And I was like, well, because I don't want to be with the same people that I've known since I was like 10 years old.
Right.
At college, because it's not going to, because I knew as a queer person, like, I was just bursting to try to come out of my shell, and I couldn't do that there. And so, and I was like, I was set on going to NYU, and my family was like, no, you can't go to New York. That's it's too dangerous. Again, whatever. In hindsight, I'm grateful that happened, because I started college in September of 2001, right? Imagine being at New York as a first-month college kid, immigrant, in the middle of, as a darker skinned person, right? The amount of racism that I faced in Boston, I can only imagine what it would have been like had I been in New York at that time. And I think it would have shifted my whole framing of the world in a different way. And I don't know if it would have been better or worse, but it would have been different. Right. And so for me to feel like I'm going to pay for college, I'm going to go by myself, because my parents were like, we'll buy you a car, we'll pay for your school. And I was like, if you go to UConn, I was like, nope. Like, I believe I need to do what's right for me, even if it's going to put me in debt for the next 30 years of my life. And that's what I did. And so that was getting them to say okay to it, even if it was unwillingly. That was the turning point, because I recognize the power of my own ability to do what's right for me, even when people around me don't want me to do it.
Powerful. That's so powerful. And I think, like, not enough people feel like they have the agency to be able to do that. Mm-hmm. And again, I think this is another testament to, like, you and your journey and your development, is that, like, you knew what you needed to do for yourself, and you had the self-actualization to be like, I need to do this for me, because it's so important that I do this for my future, for my happiness, for my journey in general. And I think, like, that's something that a lot of people sometimes don't have that same level of ability to do, and especially with parents and sometimes cultural forces that are surrounding them, that they feel pressure to do. I need to follow the playbook that was given to me, and if I stray from it, like, I will deal with, like, the blowback of that, which I think that's part of life, unfortunately. You know what I mean? And it's like, you have to be able to live your life for you, because at the end of the day, it's you're the one that has to live it first person POV, right?
Yeah, and again, that's part of the tension. I think that is as both of us having grown up in the US, it's very easy to say, but it is a hard thing to actually navigate, right? So I'm grateful for a couple of things. One is, having been born and raised as a boy has definitely made my life better, right? In some ways, because I think had I been born female in India, I don't know if my family would have even adopted me to bring to the US. I would have been like, and so that, I think my whole life would just be significantly different. Or even if they had brought me to the US, they would not have let me go as far, even to push back in the cultural way that I did, to say, I'm going to go to the school anyway, I don't care. That I was given more freedoms that my sisters have never been given in any way. And so they, like, even though I identify as gender queer now, I think the masculinity, the way I was raised as a boy, has given me the ability to be more aggressive in my sense of self, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And to have it recognized and acknowledged that, like, none of the women in my life have had the ability to do it the same way. Right. And so I think there's something there around, I'm grateful for that that helped me kind of feel like I could understand and navigate using the masculinity as a source of agency for myself in a way that didn't hurt. Two was that education has always been important to my family. So I had this aunt and uncle of mine. They're not related to me by blood, but they lived 20 minutes away. And like part of the immigrant experience is that you create family. This is why I'm like chosen family so easy for me, because I'm like, I grew up creating chosen family because immigrants, that's what we do. And so, and it's interesting because my family's like, why do you have all these friends? I'm like, well, because you taught me how to make chosen family, because that's how we survived in this world, coming here in the like late 80s, early 90s, right? And particularly to freaking middle of nowhere, Illinois, and then to California, and then to Connecticut, and there's all the different places. But really think it's, so this aunt and uncle, I love them. They're just like brilliant. They both got married later in life, and they never had children of their own. So their children, like the rest of us, like kind of all of us grew up around them, have kind of adopted them as our aunt and uncle, and just good people. And my aunt Jayshree, she has a PhD in linguistics from NYU. And her father's a great scholar. And my mom was always fascinated. She's like, one, like, this is cool that there's a woman who has a PhD, let alone PhD in linguistics, let alone from NYU, one of the best, and in Sanskrit literature. Right. Wow. And so my mom was, but then my mom was always like, fast, because she was like, why don't you do anything with it? My aunt was like, because I didn't want to, I just wanted the degree. And my mom was always, because my mom only has a third grade education. She was never really allowed to study in the same. She grew up in a small village, and her mother passed away really young, and her father got married, and very Cinderella-ish, of like got treated as the evil stepchild and never really got resources, etc. So all this, like, she has her own trauma to deal with. But my mom could never really make sense of why this woman who's married to a successful person and successful herself and has this incredible degree didn't want to work. She's like, I don't need to. I don't want to. Right? She's like, I wanted to do it just because I wanted to. And so I'm so grateful that I had that model of knowing that you could do something just because you want to, not because you needed to or you have to survive. And that was a really different, because growing up as a low-income first-gen immigrant, there was a lot of work on survival and a lot of work on sending money back to India so that people in India could benefit. Right? My parents have always been like, they will give their shirts to literally anyone except for themselves, which is silly. And so this is where them and I fight a little. But so my aunt and uncle, so she became one of my key counselors, if you will. So I would go to her and say, hey, I remember going to her and saying, I want to go to college in Boston. Well, my parents are saying no. Can you help? And so then, because my parents respected her, like, she would actually do some of the work for me and saying, why? And so she would just like help negotiate for me. So it wasn't just this stupid little teenager that was being too American and bratty, but like, why it actually makes sense. Because I would actually say arguments to my aunt and say, here's the 7 reasons why I want to go to BU, right? And I visited BU 7 times before I actually decided to even go there. So I was like, I wanted to be fully clear. And like, would I have done that now? Probably not. I'm not sure. But it's what I needed to do to like get out of the context of where I was in, so I could become who I am today. And so I think the ability to hold that tension and to be able to figure out like how to navigate, and having this role model as someone that defied this boundaries of who could get an education, what education was for, and what you could study, and where and how. I think that really helped shape for me that there's a different way to exist in the world that didn't fit the binary systems that I thought was the only way to exist.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That was a long story, but hopefully
I think that's great. That's great. It's great context, honestly. Yeah. So I want to kind of like pivot a little bit to focus on like the constellation approach that you have around. I think this is such a fascinating model that you kind of came up with in your book. I think it's definitely one of the more unique aspects of Queer and Constellations in its using of stars and connections as a metaphor for mapping identity and belonging. For someone who's never picked up the book, how does this approach work, and what does it offer that traditional frameworks can't?
Yeah, that's such another great question too, Andraé. Thank you for that. Again, my whole life has been at the Borderlands. It's about pushing boundaries and being creative, right? And that what does it mean to give birth to things that don't exist? And so for me, when I thought about writing a memoir, one, I had people like, why do you write a memoir? You're only 40, whatever. Like that, like you're not old enough to write a memoir. I was like, what does that mean? Like, everyone that has a story has a story, and like a story and a memoir is literally just a collection of memories, is what it means, right?
Right.
And so like we all have memories from the time we were born, right? And maybe even before we were born, we have memories from previous lives. Like what does it mean? And so for me, it was important to recognize that storytelling is a key part of how I exist in the world, and why, like, being a storyteller and being a community builder, being a source of positive change. Like, those are 3 important pillars for how I navigate the world. right? And so I thought about, like, how do I tell my story in a way that isn't just another fucking book, right? How many memoirs are there? How many stories are there? There's billions of stories, billions of books, billions of memoirs. But what is it that's going to actually not just, I wanted people to have an experiential reading versus just an oratory reading, right? I don't want to just say, here's my story, take it, Andraé, read it. Now you have my story. It felt very transactional and even colonial to take someone else's story and just make your own without any interaction or interchange. And I wanted to say, when we think about constellations, we somehow just take them for granted. Like, yeah, these 7 stars equal blah, blah, blah constellation. And if we look at the history of constellations, right, there's a couple of folks, I mean, most of us go to kind of the Greco-Roman European understanding of the constellations, but they stole them from Egypt and China and other places, right? Who had even more. But again, we have had stars as long as the universe has existed, right? But it's not and while there's billions and billions of stars in the sky, why is it that we choose these 7 stars, say, oh, those 7 stars are this constellation? Right? We make meaning of those 7 because we choose to. So the meaning is not the fact that like they're magically like in the stars don't even care, right? In the universe, they like because it's very much based on my perspective from this corner of the earth. I see this particular constellation of these stars. But if you were in a different part of the universe, that concept there's just no way that it could exist in that way because it's a different framework, a different context. And so understanding the context and understanding how I see something is equally important as to what I am seeing. It becomes a really important bridge between the author and the reader. And we don't often do that in our culture. It's often just like the author gives you a book, you read it and you're good to go. And then you make your own, and then you move on to your next pursuit. And there's no other interaction. And for me, I wanted to be able to feel like that doesn't feel liberatory to me. That doesn't feel communal to me. And stories are meant to be shared, and stories are meant to be interacted with and played with. And so how do you create a book and with text on a piece of paper that could feel like our conversation right now, that feels there's a more of an exchange and interchange? And so the idea that like the way you constellate something changes the meaning that it has. And so the meaning making becomes really important. So how you read the book is important. So if you read the story about my uncle almost killing me because I stole a piece of bread from his plate, before you read about my adoption story, right? Those it might influence the second story differently, right? And we as humans, we've survived for the whatever thousands of years that we have because we're experiential learners and we learn from whatever our previous experiences. When you encounter something new, it's like when I have white people who've never had Indian food in India go and say, oh, I don't like this as much as I like Indian food in Wisconsin. I'm like, well, that's because
it's Wisconsin.
Well, also, but that's it's like, but if you were to take some Indian person and put them into, and they've had Chinese food in India and then go to China, it's like this. I like China because we often tend to like what we know first because it becomes a foundation for how
familiar,
right? And so that foundation, and so how do we unravel this story making process and the layering of our experience of the space? So I want people to actually to kind of play with it, and understand it, and sit with it, and to really focus on the why and how, and not just the what, because the what is easy, the story, right? Yeah. But also I didn't want to just tell a story in linear fashion. I'm like, my life, I don't think of my life as linear, nor are we as humans. Yes, we have a linearity, it's like we're born and we die. Like there's linearity in that, but beyond, there's no other linearity really in like the way our life evolves. There's lots of twists and turns and forks and stops and dead ends or whatever. But like, and so how do we actually role model that into a book? Like, how do you do that? And so I want people to also feel like they have some agency in understanding my story. And I want people to sit with the dissonance of what does it mean for me to give meaning to someone else's story, and who gives my own life meaning and how I understand my life. So I wanted to be a reflective process as well. And so really thinking about the constellating, helping the reader recognize that they're not just a passenger in the back seat. They're actually the driver of this journey, of this book, right? I am the passenger in this book in some ways because I'm telling the story, but I'm the navigator, but they're the driver in this book. And I wanted them to feel like really take advantage of being clear about where they're going and knowing what they need to do that, right? So if there's some people who are like, I don't like that, that's too scary, I just want to read them front to back. That's great. You can read it from front to back, and the story will make sense as it is.
Right.
Well, it's one way of making sense, But then if you were to start with chapter 25 and then go to 10 and then go to 7, that's going to be different for you. So I didn't want just people to just jump around because I wanted to be a more of an interactive adventure. I want people to actually track what that means for them, because the way you, Andraé, read the book might be very different than Albert reads the book, might be different than the way I or someone else would read the book. And that changes my story. If you were to look at the constellation from a different universe or different planet, it's going to look different. So I want people to understand that it's not just a perspective difference, it's actually a meaning making difference. And to own that meaning making difference actually makes it your own experience. And that you get to also be a co-creator in the work, a co-author, if you will, because I also didn't want to be just a transactional. It was like, you just take my story and leave without having to do any of your own sharing, where I've just poured my heart out on this paper of with stories I've never told anyone in my life before, right? Or letters I've never shown to anyone before it went into print. So it requires the audience to also write your own pieces into the book. And even the book itself is colorable. The cover of the book is black and white. So you can actually color it in and I have some friends who every time they read a piece, they'll color a different part of the cover. So that by the end of the book, the art piece they've created on the front cover becomes a manifestation of how they've understood the book, which is this collective mosaic of their own understanding of my story, which becomes this constellation of our relationship as well.
I honestly, that was one of my favorite things about when I was reading your book. I was just I love the fact that you start the book off by setting the context of this is your choose your own adventure.
Right.
It's an interactive situation here where you're a part of this journey just as much as I, the writer, am guiding you on this journey. I love the way that there was, like you said, you could easily make it a linear read, but then it's also this thing where you can hop around. You could see this story and go to this story after. And I think that made it much more of an exciting and unique experience. I don't think I've ever read a book like that, which I thought was just so cutting edge and just so interesting for me. Cause it's books, like you said, are very transactional. It's I'm the author, I'm broadcasting to you what I want you to read. But there's the interaction of the coloring, the reading prompts. There's just so much of it that it felt like when you were writing it, at least from my perspective, it felt like you were talking directly to me as the reader and letting me go along in the process, and just having that level of interaction is something I've never experienced. And I love that you did that because it just made it much more fun and fulfilling. And I think that's something that books, they like to follow kind of similar kind of frameworks. And I think that works, if you're trying to tell a very specific story, but it's when you're trying to show the complexity and expansiveness of one's journey and your constellation approach to storytelling, I think it's it makes it more, there's just more of a return on investment, I think, for the reader to be able to be a part of that journey versus just being spoken to. Do you know what I mean? Which I thought was just so brilliant. And I love that. How did you come up with that idea just in general? What was that while you were planning, while you're writing it, or was that beforehand that you're I want to make this just different than you would a traditional book?
Yeah, I don't know. A part of my process, I don't have a process. I just go. It's been really intentional for me to just give myself. In 2019, I left a job that was toxic and just a terrible environment, and sold my house, sold my car, gave my stuff away, packed a carry-on suitcase, and just started traveling the world, living out of just a carry-on suitcase. And I never thought that was something that I would ever want to do as a very Taurian person who likes pretty things. But it was one of the most liberating things I've ever experienced in my life. I recognize it's not the things that I have that give me meaning. It's the people and the relationship and the connection, and the constellations that I navigate in the world that gives me meaning. And so that was really interesting. And then to think about really as I thought about actually being serious about writing, I'm so glad I found my publisher, Dr. Angela Yarber, who's an incredible writer herself. And she started a publishing company a couple of years ago. I was oh, that's kind of cool. I love her. I like the work that she's doing. That's great. And then at some point I was oh, maybe I could write a book with her. And so she was doing this 3-month book writing group process. And so I was oh, let's just do it for the fun of it, see what happens. And so I took part in that. And I was I had a list of stories. I collected all the different things I've written, different parts of my life, and some blogs and some stories and different, the story about my New Year's Eve where I kissed the statues, literally from something I wrote 15 years ago. Right. And I was this, and I didn't change it because I wanted to kind of keep that youngness in my writing. And
right.
Even the writing just isn't, I was trying to not create one voice because I'm not one being. I'm the different beings that I have been that's got me to where I am. And I want to kind of really be honoring to wherever I was in the process of my own writing journey. But then I was thinking about, I actually was able to, I'm so grateful that my friend Karen, who has a cabin in Big Bear, I was trying to find a place to, initially my goal was to just go to Maine and be on an island somewhere in the middle of January to write. And it just wasn't working. And I couldn't figure it out. And I was really annoyed. I was talking to Karen. She's like, I have a cabin. Just go stay there. I was like, really? She's like, yeah. So she literally picked me up from the train station. We go grocery shopping and she drops me off at the cabin. And I don't see another human, except for I saw one other random human as I was on my walk for a whole month. And I just sat and wrote. And I just allowed myself to lean into allowing the book for it to birth itself rather than me telling how to write the book. So I would sit, I would read a couple other memoirs. I'd watch some movies and documentaries. I'd make some food. I would take a nice little walk every day, sit and watch the snow. And then I would just like at night, I'd get into bed and I'd start writing, and I'd just start writing whatever stories came to me that day. I would just start writing and see where it went. And as I was writing, I realized I was like, I don't just want this to be another book.
Right.
I want it to be a movement creation, right? I want it to be an experience that allows for people to feel like it is we're able to break boundaries. So one thing I realized during COVID, I ended up being stuck in Chicago for about 8 months randomly. And I started making art, and I just started making art because I was like, I just need something to process. I had some health issues. So I was afraid of going out. There's all these protests that were happening. It was around the time of Black Lives Matter and George Floyd, but there's just lots of hats and I didn't know what to do. And so I just started doodling. And I've always been a doodler, but I've never thought about it as like an art form. I just started, but I've always done meditative art as well. And so I started making art. I just went to Blick Art and I just like bought like $100 worth of art supply. I just started drawing. My friend's like, what the f*** are you doing with all the art? I was like, I don't know. It's like my body's telling me to make art, so I can do it. And so I'm so grateful for, as terrible as those first couple of months of COVID were, it forced me to slow down and to align and to be able to be in tune enough to listen to my heart and listen to my spirit within that needed me to make art in the way it did, very visual art, right? And in doing so, I ended up making a coloring book, and I love that. And one of my favorite stories with the coloring book was that it was right around May. There was a series of murders of Asian women, particularly at a salon in Atlanta. And I remember a friend of mine who's Korean American in New York reaching out to me a couple of weeks later being like, hey, I just want to say thank you. I was like, what do you mean? She was like, I had given one of your coloring books to my grandma, and who's like a Korean American woman in her 60s. She doesn't speak English at all, but she just sent me this image. She sent me a copy of these coloring pages she had colored, and she said it's been helping her make sense of the world. And I was like, and I just started crying because I was like, what does it mean that like, I don't know who this person is, this older woman, right? We don't have a language we can speak and share, but yet art allowed us for me to help her healing without me even trying. And that's the beauty of art and any form of art. It's like we were able to have ripples of impact without knowing what we're doing if we do it with the pureness of our heart. And so part of the reason so then I was like, I want the book to also be able to reach people when they don't necessarily speak English. So I struggled with writing in English because I was like, English is still my strongest language. It's one of my 5 languages that I speak. But it's a colonial language. It's not the language that's my native language. So it feels weird to feel like this is what I need to communicate. It's also what allows me to reach the most amount of people. But how do I make, if I really want this to be a liberatory journey for not just me to get my stories out of my body so it's not decaying my body, but to also like help other people unlock their own journeys, then it has to be able to go beyond language skills, right? And have a colonial European standards of what language matters. So I wanted to have art in the book, and really important. And then I was like, I also want people to feel like it's not just me telling my story, but they get to also they get to sit next to me. So when I'm reading the letters that I have, it's like, these are letters that like someone's reading with me, right? It's not like you're reading my letter to me, but like you're reading it as I'm writing it, if that makes sense. Right?
Absolutely does.
And so I wanted to kind of I wanted to break that wall between reader and writer and time and space. And like, we can actually, the power of liberation is that we can do that. The universe has always been about breaking boundaries and systems and embracing the chaos that comes with it. And then lastly, I was like, so I want the art in there. I wanted the stories. So it's just like, I like telling stories. I wanted letters. So I felt like I wanted to feel like someone's reading my journal, or like my personal letter that maybe they've intercepted along the way. And then I was like, I also want to be able to think about like, what other things can you do words that are, and so like for me, poetry, I don't consider myself an amazing poet, but I like poetry. So I was like, you know what? My book is not about perfection. My book is about being myself. And I like poetry, so I'm going to write poetry because I like poetry. And so I was like, I'm just going to put in things that are pretty to me and that make sense to me. So I've tried to infuse words and wordplay into that as well, because I think it's about, you get to see my own journey of me understanding my own different kind of elements of who I am and how I navigate the world through the way you choose to read, or you can understand the different access points, right? I also chose not to put in a glossary for some of the Kannada or Tamil words that I put in there. Sometimes I put in parentheses of like what it means, but I don't, but other times I don't. Because I also am like, I want you to also struggle with that. Because I, as someone who moved here at 7 years old and didn't speak a lot of English and felt like I was made to feel stupid, and I don't want people to feel stupid when they read the book, but I want people to understand the difficulty of not knowing a language that you're trying to access, not knowing a culture you're trying to access, not knowing a community and experience and a life that you're trying to access, but that is required for you to survive, right? And that tension, I want people to feel. That's what it is. I want the book to not just be a brain read. I want it to be a heart and a spirit read. I want you to feel it in your bones.
Yeah. And I think honestly that came across so well. And I loved the fact that like it felt like each chapter was its own journey. I love the fact that you changed the format from story to poetry to reader prompts to letters, personal letters. I thought that was so vulnerable and authentic. And I think it was just such an interesting way to like structure it. And I really love that about it because it just made it feel like I said before, it's like, and you even said it, it's like your own journal, and we're privy to what has gone on, you know, throughout your journey and, you know, both the highs and the lows, and just being able to experience like the raw emotions from your POV. I thought was just so both heart-wrenching, but also heartwarming too, I think, in that way, because it felt so human. And I think that's the thread there. It's that it's such a universal experience of emotions that people can experience in one's lifetime. And I think you did such a great job of capturing that. And you also kind of write about, you know, challenging colonial binaries around gender and power and belief. What's something those binaries have made invisible in your own life or community?
So the tagline for the book, right? It's Queer Constellation, mapping this journey called life. And that's the second part is a little tribute to Prince, who had just recently passed a couple of years ago, right before I started writing the book. And I really want to think about like, what is this journey called life? What the are we doing on this, as you see the background, right? Like all these stars and things that exist in the universe. Like the universe is so freaking big and like, ever expanding, and like we're this very insignificant speck. And yet we take ourselves so seriously, but like, how do we actually map out what this journey is so we make sense of it? And so I think there's something there around the binaries and understanding kind of going beyond what we're taught is reality, and recognize like reality is much more complex and that there's much more, the universe is more gray than it does black and white. Right. Yeah. And so, and the grayness is where we get to be powerful. I think about my relationship with my family and how much they have struggled to make sense of my journey and the way I have chosen to live my life. And I think it has made our love invisible. I still have a relationship with a lot of my family, but also a very tense relationship at best. And so I think at some point I had to stop trying to get them to understand me, because I was like, that's too much. I'm putting too much effort on their understanding of me, so I'm not even able to be myself and really feel like I need to. And so I've had to make a really intentional choice to focus on myself and doing what I want to do in my own locus of control, rather than trying to get them to understand or see me as I see myself. And part of that has just been the healing journey and therapy, thank goodness, but also recognize that like, I will never get them to see me as I see myself, unfortunately. Right. And that's okay. And so I've had to let go. I've had to be okay with the binary of it will always be a them and me. It will never be us.
Right.
I think that's really hard. The other piece is thinking about so much of queerness feels so white, European, American. And we somehow think of like Western queerness as being more progressive and more accessible and more accepting. And it's like, actually, I feel more unsafe on the streets of the US most of the time than I do when I'm in Colombia or in France or somewhere else in the world, or even in India sometimes, right? And so the binary of whiteness and white European cultural standards, particularly around gayness and queerness, as being somehow better than. I think that's a binary that's actually a misnomer, particularly given the current political moment that we're in and how much intentional harm is being done to us as transgender queer folks and community folks and queer folks across the board. I think the fact that like it is nothing in life is really this or the other except for death in life.
Right.
Everything else is great, really, for the most part.
Yeah. No, I agree. And it's like, the reality is like, I think we talked about this before actually the interview actually even started, is just like that there is so much to be learned from and gained from the nebulous state of discomfort and not having clear binary decisions around anything around life. It's binaries are easy because it's very simple. It's this or that. And for a lot of people, they can't sometimes grasp the complexities and depth of understanding anything outside of those binaries. And I think like that we grow when we are learning, and we are only really learning when we're in states of discomfort or we're outside of our comfort zone, or just like those areas where like we're experiencing the most emotion, the most stress, the most, discord, you know what I mean? And I think like that's something to be embraced. And I think like a lot of times people want to avoid discomfort because it's not fun sometimes, but it's where we are able to gain, experience. It's where we're able to gain understanding. It's where we're able to just discover ourselves in deeper ways than we would otherwise. And, one thing I wanted to discuss with you is like this concept of intersectionality, because as somebody who has so many identities that you are holding in your individual person, you weave, being queer, immigrant, API of Desi American descent, spiritual. How do those like overlapping identities shape your approach to community care?
It gives me a sense of responsibility to do something, right? And as someone who sits at so many different layers of intersections and pathways, right? It's like it's easy for me to say, oh, I don't want to be this, I just want to be that. Because I can't, right? Like our world makes it easier when we can I just want to be this and not that. And I think that's, again, I think the binary, it connects to the binary, right? And someone's like, intersectionality cannot exist in a lot of binaries because it requires to do one or the other. It's a very easy way for people to organize life and to be safe. Life is not about safety. Life is about unearthing and I don't like the word discover, but I guess discover, that's fine. Discover, right? Really, discover just means to uncover, right? Uncover, to unearth, to really be able to like shed the layers, right? We're in the year of the snake right now. And so like this shedding that is required for us to think about community, like to be able to recognize that we're all shedding things right now, like wherever you are. And so there's the three pieces, like my approach, the community, and the care. I think those are three separate, like what is my approach? My approach would be to say, how do I find my own intersections, right? I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico now, right? And so for me, I'm like, why the heck Albuquerque, New Mexico? People are always like, why the heck did you move to Albuquerque, New Mexico? I'm like, I don't know, the universe told me to move. So I came here once and the universe, the mountain said, you need to be here. So I was like, okay, I'm moving. And people are like, but that doesn't make sense. I'm like, you don't know anyone there. I was like, yeah, but I'll find people. Like might be like, I'm comfortable in the fact that the universe will bring me the people that I need to meet to build my community, because community is always important to like, and I'm grateful that I have community in most places that I go. Like that's really important. So the approach for me is the leaning into universal sense of self and believe in the fact that like she will not, like universe will not guide me astray. She's always been able to kind of guide me. So I think there's kind of a trusting divine providence in the most non-Christian way possible, right? If you will, to kind of feel like she's going to take care of me. And then she's going to give me the tools to how to help other people take care of themselves as well. So as I think about community, who is my community? One of my favorite stories of my childhood is when I was in high school. First year, I was in the middle of coming out as a queer person. I wasn't really comfortable yet. And there was a group called Alianza Latina, which is kind of a Latin American student group. I grew up in Connecticut, huge Puerto Rican and Cuban population, kind of Caribbean Latin population, if you will. And there was like a school assembly and people were like, there's a dance that some of the folks from the Alianza Latina group did. And like, even if you're not Latino, come hang out with us. And there was this really cute boy that I had a huge crush on. And I was like, this is the way. This is maybe the way I get to know this person. Nothing ever happened with this person. He's happily married with children now, right? He's fine. But it got me into this community, which was just such a cool, like, never as a non-Latino, Latinx or Latina person, never that I feel like that's where, like, because I never found community with my South Asians, because they were all, like, as a first-gen low-income immigrant kid, a poor kid, right? My father made $17,000 a year for most of his life. And it was a family of three. We were living in the projects. Like, it was just a very different experience. And so so I never got along, not that I never got along, but I never had anything in common with the other South Asian kids who were often children of doctors and engineers and people that came to the temple, but never saw me as an equal peer to them, always saw me as a little bit less than. Whereas the folks at the Alianza Latina group, they didn't care. Like, I was actually closer in color to most of them than I was to a lot of the South Asians in my school. But also, like, for me, I've always been an avid learner. I love language. I love culture. I just was like, I'm just enamored by how similar South Asian culture and Latinx culture is in terms of the food and the spices and the music and the chaos and the dancing and this love for life in a different way that I felt at home. That was just really beautiful. And actually, to the point where I went from being like just a participant to being the official photographer, just so I volunteered so I can go to this person's house, the cute person's house, and take pictures of everyone, just so I could be with them. Again, nothing happened, but it gave me the ability to, like, help. Being a photographer, I was a very shy, nerdy kid, if you can believe it or not. Like, I'm a very loud person now, but I was a very shy, nerdy kid. And so being behind the camera gave me the safety of being able to observe people and to see how relationships and communities worked without having to actually do anything with it. But then the year later, I was volunteering. There was a couple of hurricanes in the Caribbean. We were doing eyeglass drives. We were doing fun drives. We were doing blankets and toilet paper. Like, I was just involved in all of it. And then my senior year, they actually asked me to run for it and actually voted me to be president of Alianza Latina group.
Wow.
And I was like, and that just felt like it was both weird, right? And now I'm like, with that, should I even have done that? But I was like, again, it was not me, like, I want to be a leader. It was the community, like, no, we feel like you're part of us. And so for me, this idea that, like, community care, like, being able to see the core of someone who, regardless of what labels or what identities they hold, maybe not regardless of, but in addition to, that was a really beautiful lesson for me. And it was just such a cool space to sit and to be able to lead an organization and to say, like, being Latino did not have to do with your ethnic and cultural background, but about how you lead in the world. Right. And I was like, that's really cool. And so I was like, and that's very similar to South Asian culture. And so this idea that, like, finding our people and finding communities are not necessarily about skin folk ain't always our kinfolk, right? And that's actually really critical. And actually recognize that, like, you can find spiritual aligned siblings, if you will, all around the universe, wherever you are, right? I love talking to people on planes. One of my favorite stories is I was just in Japan in December, and on New Year's Day, I was on my way down from Osaka to Nara to go to, there's a little town where there's all these little deer that just run around everywhere. It's super cute. And there's a beautiful Buddhist temple. I want to go to the temple. And I sit in this train. It was an early morning ride, and I was taking a picture of a paper crane that I had made, connected to the book as well, because it was just a beautiful sunrise, the morning, the sunlight coming through the train windows. And this random person sits next to me, this Japanese man that doesn't speak a lot of English. I don't speak very much Japanese. I thank goodness for Google Translate. And we start chatting, and we just had this and then by the end of it, he offered me a box of sweets, and I offered him a bag of oranges, and we take pictures on both of our phones. And we just had this moment. Like, I don't know who this, I've never seen this person ever again in my life, but it was such a beautiful moment of, like, that the community care for me is being receptive to the fact that there's lots of good in the world and lots of people that want to create care in the world. There's that piece. And then there's a responsibility of that, right? So, like, most of my time in LA, I was involved in Satrang, which is a South Asian queer LGBT group in LA, which I loved, to be able to like take up space and to add to what it means to be queer, South Asian, Desi American in Southern California, but also what does it mean to then be part of a network of organizations across the country and across the world? And what does it mean to feel like there's a responsibility to both be witness to what's happening and to also contribute to what's happening, and that we have agencies in both. And that's what allows us to create kind of what is a holistic sense of community care, that we're not just taking, but we're also contributing. And this not even dichotomy, the synergy of giving and taking is what's always been core to a lot of us, of the global majority, of how we've navigated communities and cultures and practices, and to kind of break the sense of individuality and isolation, and recognize that isolation may be important, like my month in my cabin by myself, but it's also not how we heal.
Right.
We are not healers by ourselves. Even the Borderlands cannot exist by ourselves, because you need to border something, right? Like the Borderlands has to have two borders for it to actually. So even the source of our creativity and our energy and our kind of magic comes from this tension of more than one.
I love that. No, I think that's so beautiful. And I think just like the importance of being in community, I think is so crucial for our own development. Like you said, our own healing. It's like we cannot exist in a silo, whether it's on an individual level or on a macro level. It's like we have to be able to understand that we are part of a global community. There are so many people from different walks of life, different languages, cultures, all that stuff, that like there is so much of the world to be explored and embraced and discovered and unearthed, like you said, that like when we create silos, when we isolate from other cultures, we're not just doing, a disservice of like, the intercultural connection, but a disservice to ourselves to not be able to expose ourselves to all the beauty that the world has to offer. And I think like that's where I think a lot of like conservative right-wing ideology that feels very isolationist stems from. And they don't realize that them doing that is it's much bigger than just, them not wanting to interact with certain types of people. They're doing themselves a disservice by not being able to understand the beauty that the world holds. You know what I mean? And I think like in your book, I think, there's so many different stories, and I'm curious to know, like, is there a specific story for you, or an illustration even, that like you find yourself coming back to again and again, that kind of teaches you something as you continue to review it and absorb it?
No, I think what you said, I want to add on to that, and also add into the answer too. But I think I do agree with you that like the current isolationist framework that we have, this whole America first, is not actually the way the world is ever been able to heal or grow, or like everyone has to be good for us to be good, right? One person being unhappy does not mean someone else gets like. That's the me versus you creates such a border that isn't actually real. Like none of our borders are actually real.
They're all human made. It's like
right.
It's not real. None of it's real, and they're like trying to enforce this idea of like this is my land, this is your land, don't cross my like. It's just ridiculous. Like the world is everyone's. Like really.
Yeah. And I mean, and not even ours. We are simply temporary. We're simply temporary passengers on this larger journey called the universe. She has been here before us. She's going to be here way after us, right? Exactly. And so the universe and this earth, right? They're so sacred. So I do think there's something about, I mean, part of the community care piece, I'm going to add on to that as well, is recognize that there's our core purpose on this earth is to learn to align with the universal sense of balance and alignment, right? And this idea of like aligning with this larger balance and journey of like healing, right? Recognize like the universe, like she has cycles. Like we have a winter and a spring for a reason, right? You need the shedding and you need the growth and you need the tension that comes between those, right? A plant doesn't cry because it's growing new branches, right? It's actually part of the growth, and it doesn't cry because it's losing leaves. It knows it's going to like we as humans. Maybe this is too general of a statement, but I'm going to make it anyway, have become so unable to hold that loss and growth are not only core to who we are, but essential to who we are, is necessary for this work. And that and the ability to be evolving and ever changing and aligning with the fact that there's seasons that happen. The universe has seasons, and if you think about the fact, like, again, we're such a small blip, if that, even in the larger history of the universe, and to feel like somehow we have to like and focusing. I think what I see the current political moment, this isolationist framework that, as you said, that's so focused on me and my wealth and my people and my boundaries, my. It's like there's a reason why for so long Europeans thought that Earth was the center of the universe, and most other cultures that are beyond the European construct never really felt like that in the same way. right? And that once we learned that the earth is not the center of the universe, things shifted. And no, like, it didn't fall apart. It just helped us feel like we're one of a larger solar system and a larger universe that is ever expanding and growing and shifting. And like, we are shifting, and like, that's actually good. Like the evolution and the understanding and the alignment, the fact that there's pieces that move in and out, and like those are, it just is. It's like, and the controlling isn't necessary, because it's how you learn to flow and align with the larger system, and the energy of the universe is what allows us to heal and grow. So there's that piece of it, right? But I think to your piece of like the story that I keep coming back to, there's a story about an older grandfather that teaches me how to make a paper crane in the book. And it's told in a book and a story and a poem, if you will. And then there's a piece that's actually a paper crane that you can actually color in. And I love that image. And I love the fact that like this energy itself in the world is just energy. It's kind of neutral in some ways. There's no positive. It's not good or bad. It's not evil or holy, or it just is. Energy is just energy. Right. The energy that we put into it is what transforms it, right? The fact that like a bird can fly and a paper can become a bird that can fly, when the paper itself is made of death of a tree, right? That you connect tree to earth to water that's needed to make it into paper, right? And then it can go into as a bird into the sky, and it becomes like all the elements become connected by this one experience, and that we are part of that larger experiment of the universe. So I really enjoy the fact like I get to, when I look at a piece of paper, I can see it as garbage, or I can see it as a paper crane waiting to happen. And that requires me to feel like I can put my energy transformation changes the universe for the better or worse based on what I do with that, right? And then going back to, I'm a fan of Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a Vietnamese Zen Buddhist monk who passed away a couple of years ago. One of my spiritual teachers, probably for about 16, 17 years now. And I spend a lot of time on planes, and I love sitting on the window because I love watching the world out the window. Because it also helps me recognize how small we are.
Yeah.
Because once you're in a plane, you see like all these massive mega trucks look like little the Game of Life. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. Those little, and so it helps me feel like I can pull myself out of the daily chaos and feel like, okay, this is all like, you can't hear the chaos. You can't hear the people honking. You just see pretty things moving like little ants, and you see all the clouds. And part of the clouds, and one of my favorite sayings is like, drink your tea, drink your cloud. So I love drinking tea on a plane, because it's like really gets me to feel like, okay, this water that's in my cup that's warmed right now is because of these different resources that we are using from the universe. I'm grateful for the people that have made the thing that like allows me to fly in the freaking air, that allows me to have the resources to sit in this plane, the resources to actually like have this tea and to enjoy this tea and to be aware of what I'm drinking, right? All the tea leaves that were made, how many hands have touched this tea that have helped me to get this in this moment. But then even more so recognize that tea is not possible without the clouds that I see out the freaking window, right? And if I'm not able to make that connection, that like I am simply, and then once I drink this tea and I go pee, then it goes into the water, then it becomes a cloud again. Then I want to drink that tea again at some point. Like the fact that I am not the beginning nor the end, I am simply a conduit for everything, all this system, again, this alignment, right? Once I decenter my own self, I'm able to feel like I become part of the larger movement, if you will, right? Yeah. And I think for me, the paper crane is also that. The fact that like this paper crane the energy that I can put into the paper. I did not make the paper. I did not make the crane. I did not make how to make the paper crane, but I did not even learn how to, like someone taught me how to make the paper crane, right? So I'm using all these different skills. So when I make a paper crane, it's not just me making a paper crane, but I'm honoring the grandfather that taught it to me. The little girl in Hiroshima who died right after the bomb, who was trying to make 1,000 paper cranes, that started the whole paper crane making project around the world, that made kind of Japanese paper art and paper crane making kind of an international experience, right? And that where now people still make paper cranes, and it connected me to different people in the world who also make paper cranes, to then think about what's the math involved, what's the geometry, what's the art involved, and then what is my role to teach other people to do that. And the fact that when I was on this train in Japan, this moment that I had with Kenji, this person that was sitting next to me, was because I was making a paper crane and taking pictures of it, right? And so like all of that is involved in this one piece of paper.
Yeah.
And there's one skill. And so for me, that's why that story keeps coming. It's like this idea that like there's a larger journey that I'm a part of. So I get to understand what my role is in that space, but also don't get to make it about myself. But I get to recognize that I get to put energy into things. And that's how I live my life every day. It's like, what am I going to do today to transform energy into a positive energy, right? Every morning I wake up and I do a prayer for universal peace. Every time I go to bed, I do a prayer for universal peace. Is it doing something right now? I don't freaking know, right? But am I going to stop doing it? No, because I believe that like I can still send positive energy into the universe because it does, the energy and does transform the core being of every atomic existence in the universe, period.
What a fantastic way to end the deep space dive. All right, that brings us to the final frontier, our signature closing segment. We ask every guest the same 5 questions to wrap things up with some fast takes, real talk, and a peek at what makes you, you. Answer as quickly or as thoughtfully as you'd like. There are no wrong answers, so let's get into it. The first question I have is, what is your go-to queer anthem that never fails to get you pumped?
It's got to be Whitney Houston's I Want to Dance with Somebody. It's always a song that just makes me happy, joyful, and just the idea that, like, again, this idea of community, like this idea of like desire and this idea of being able to be free without shame or harm, and just to be able to like dance and like express desire to be together. I think it's beautiful.
I agree. Love that song. The next question I have is, if your identity came with a warning label, what would it be?
Caution, joy ahead.
I love that. We need more joy. So that is
exactly.
The next question I have is, if you could have a queer superpower, what would it be? It could be as fantastical or as grounded as you'd like.
Yeah. Protecting all the trans kids. Just putting a shield over all of them.
Literally.
Maybe can I take 2 powers?
You can, yes.
So I want to take 2 powers. So 1 is to protect them in the meantime. 2 is actually change the damn system so they don't need the protection.
Exactly. I love that. 2-pronged. We love it. The next question I have for you is, what is one piece of queer content, past or present, that has shaped you in your journey?
Ooh, I'm going to give you 3.
Please,
just
do
as
it.
I like it. Actually, 4, sorry. So 1 is going to be Noah's Ark, the TV series.
Oh, yes.
To see Black and brown queer folks enjoying, I love Daryl Stevens, but like just to see Black and brown queerness and to celebrate in a non-shaming way. That was really beautiful. 2 is Borderlands and La Frontera Godanza Lua. 3 is a book called Funny Boy by Sham Salvador, who's a South Asian, Sri Lankan queer writer, Canadian writer. And just like talks about being a young queer boy during the revolution and kind of what that, and kind of aligning with that. Short story. I remember going to London for study abroad. I studied abroad in London my junior year, my first semester of junior year in college. And I remember going to a South Asian queer dance party. It was like the first time I had been in like a room full of queer South Asians of like ever, and recognized like I could be queer and South Asian. It was one of those euphoric moments. I just sat in the middle of the dance floor with all the disco lights and I was crying because I'd never seen queer South Asian before in my life until that moment. Right. And so having that sense of release and joy and celebration in this middle of this sexy dance party with lots of beautiful people, for me, it was like life-changing.
I love that. It's beautiful. Being able to be, in a space that you feel fully embraced and accepted, I think is priceless. To be able to see yourself, to see others that are of similar, identities, I think is just so powerful. And it just reminds us that like, we're not alone. Like there's a community that is there to support us. And I think that's just so beautiful. I love that.
I think that's also why I think so many folks who have dominant identities don't understand how powerful and how rare those spaces are because they're so used to it. I think that's part of the issue in our world is that we don't have more conscious folks with power and dominant identities that are able to understand how sacred and how rare those experiences are for us, and that everyone deserves that same level of feeling euphoric joy and acceptance and belonging everywhere because we are, not because we do something or we provide some value, but because we are.
Yeah, 100% agree. The next question I have for you is, if you could go back and give your younger self one piece of advice, what would it be?
It's funny, I often used to say, the caterpillar just tell the caterpillar it's okay, you'll become a butterfly, but the butterfly is not possible without the caterpillar. And so recognize like the caterpillar is actually essential. The butterfly just cannot exist without the caterpillar. And so similarly, Thich Nhat Hanh says, no mud, no lotus, right? We celebrate the lotus because it's so pretty and beautiful. But like the only reason it exists is because it's in a swampy, mucky water, and that the mucky water is critical and is essential in the beauty of the lotus. And so the mud and the lotus and the caterpillar and the butterfly are equally critical to actually, then the caterpillar is even more important than the butterfly in some ways, because the butterfly can't exist without, right? And so
exactly
recognizing that the mud and the caterpillar, it's okay to embrace being the caterpillar and recognize that the caterpillar is what allows everything else to happen. So be the caterpillar, Embrace the caterpillar. Maybe embrace
it. Yeah, exactly. Because we already are.
Yeah, exactly.
That. Awesome. And then where can people find your book, find your work, stay connected to all that you're doing?
I love it. So you can go to queeringconstellations.org. And so you'll find information about the book. You'll find what other folks have had to say about the book. You can also submit your own poetry, stories that you write, your own letters, your own colored art pieces actually into it, because I want to create a digital catalog and collage of all that how people are engaging, understanding the book. Submit your constellation maps as well. So after the table of contents, there's a physical map you can actually track each of the different chapters and how you create your own unique constellation. So submit that as well. You can also go to rajabhattar.com. You can learn about me a little bit more and all the other things that I do. But you can find the book, and so on the website on queeringconstellations.org, you can actually also learn where to buy them. There's direct links to the publisher. You can also go to bookshop.org to support your local bookshops. You can also go to the big old monster as well and buy them there, but it's on all the major booksellers as well. But if you can support a local bookshop, go do that. And if your bookshop doesn't have it, tell them to get it, and just go to queeringconstellations.org.
Amazing. Dr. Raja, thank you so much for showing that belonging isn't about making yourself smaller to fit the world's boxes. It's about expanding so fully that the boxes disappear. Queering Constellations is not just about returning to old structures or choosing between our truths. It's about creating new constellations, spaces where every part of who we are can shine without permission or apology. Whether your compass points to ancestry, to justice, or to the quiet knowing of your own lived truth, the work is a reminder you don't have to fracture yourself to be seen. So today's cosmic key takeaway for those who are listening: you're already whole. The work isn't to change that. It is to make the world big enough to hold it. So thank you, Dr. Raja. I appreciate you and your time in this conversation. And until next time, folks, stay curious.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap for this episode of the Queerest Podcast. Thank you for joining us on this cosmic journey through the queer universe. If today's conversation resonated with you, be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with your chosen family. Your voice helps grow the queerest community. Until next time, stay curious.